it's time to take a trip into Heathenry's shadow and how it feeds many of this new movement's problems. The concept of shadow work and the shadow is something that you see a lot in not just pagan and heathen spaces, but more generally within alternative spirituality, the New Age movement, and many other places within the world. The shadow is a concept that was first developed by Swiss psychoanalyst Carl Jung as part of his broader ideas around archetypes. For Jung, the shadow represented the aspects of the inner psyche that are repressed, yet also, despite that repression, still play a vital role in shaping how we develop and what goes on within our personalities and ourselves. Usually, the concept of shadow and shadow work is used in more personal contexts. So how can one argue that an entire religious tradition has something of a shared shadow in need of working with, confronting, and resolving? The idea originally wasn't mine, but rather was something presented by Penny Billington, a longtime member of the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, at a fringe workshop as part of their 60th anniversary celebrations, which took place during the first week of June 2024 in Glastonbury. There, Billington argued that all of the different pagan traditions have their own shadow side, and while she refrained from offering comment on what that might be in the case of other traditions, she argued that the shadow which often plagues modern druidry is the desire to appear to be wise, and everything that sort of goes with that, including refraining from activities that might be seen as insufficiently serious or somber or otherwise conforming to the image of a wise druid sitting out in the grove doing wise druid things. Her argument got me to start thinking what that shadow might be in the case of heathenry. And the first place that I went, and I'm sure this is the first place many people go, was in the direction of fascism. After all, heathenry's fascist white nationalist elements are one of our most well-known problems. But when I thought about it a bit more, I realized this is a manifestation of a much deeper problem that exists within heathenry. And I think it's better to say that heathenry's real shadow, which we'll be delving into in this episode together, is its relationship with authority, and in particular, with the need by many modern heathens to construct a form of authority that makes our particular movement appear more serious, worthy of consideration, and being treated as a legitimate form of spiritual practice. It is this discomfort, this tension, and this unresolved relationship with what really constitutes authority and what legitimacy really is that I think drives many of the different problems that have cropped up within heathen practice, though certainly not all. It is also this need on the part of some practitioners to address this, for lack of a better way of putting it, inferiority complex that makes more fascist elements attractive to newer practitioners. Their ability to project an appearance of authority is part of what allows them to recruit people and appear to be a viable option for spiritual seekers. We'll be diving together into this shadow in more or less 4 broad beats. First, I'm going to get into what the relationship is between authority and spirituality generally, as well as how this can create problems depending on how authority is constructed. Along the way, I'm also going to touch on the difference between authority and legitimacy, and why sometimes people confuse the two, as well as how this confusion leads to problems. I'll then dig into the most common form that authority takes within heathen and pagan spaces, which is mimicking existing mainstream spiritual institutions, why this happens, and also raising the question of whether or not we can actually do better than this. I'll then turn back to heathenry, engaging with how authority, as is popularly understood, as well as the quest for authority, is something that tends to create more problems than it solves, mostly because it duplicates a lot of the problems that already exist within mainstream religious authorities and institutions. One of those biggest problems, which many mainstream religious institutions don't like acknowledging, is how more authoritarian and hierarchical forms of spirituality are also extremely conducive to fascism, oppression, and other destructive social systems. I'll then wrap all of this up by tackling heathenry's collective inferiority complex, by offering some ideas based on the ground that we have covered in this intellectual voyage. As you will see by the end of this episode, I think the best way forward is one that requires rejecting the false promise of authoritarian forms of spirituality, freeing ourselves of the constraints of how spirituality is supposed to be, and embracing the strengths of the movement as it currently is, so that we can better move forward in a way that is both authentically heathen and one that will be genuinely supportive and nurturing for those in the present and future of this movement. So let's begin by defining authority. Authority is one of those words that I don't think we in modern society really think that much about, because the norms of authoritarian and authority-based systems of political and social organization are so deeply embedded within the society we live in that it's almost like asking a fish to think about the water that they swim in. To turn to some dictionary standards just for a moment, so we have a place to go from. Authority is often used to refer to having the power to determine, adjudicate, or otherwise settle issues or disputes, as well as having the right to control, command, or otherwise make decisions that are meant to be binding on those under that authority's power. It can also refer to being delegated that particular power, and to a body that is vested with this kind of power. To turn to the poetic, you could say authority is the means to bind, to set loose, to delegate, and destroy. What grants authority is something that varies from society to society and from system to system. It's not hard to find examples of societies where authority was something that was vested by the divine, such as, for example, the whole concept of the divine right of kings, where one was granted the power to rule because some kind of godly power said so, usually in the form of being born into the right family. In democratic political systems, you see broad appeals to the idea of the people granting authority and power, usually through different set systems of determining who exactly gets to exercise that authority, as well as who has the right to represent the people as a broad concept. The United States is a particularly interesting example of this in action because the source of authority is specifically the American Constitution, which is described as being the summation and representation of the will of the people, while also being granted a little bit of that sort of divine mandate kind of logic in the form of the secular cult that has arisen over the course of American history around the so-called Founding Fathers. This whole concept of divine delegation is something that I think is especially important to get into when we're talking about spirituality, because all forms of spiritual practice, to some extent or another, lean into this idea of authority that is being divinely granted. Whether you are talking extremely hierarchical and somewhat oligarchic authoritarian systems like the Roman Catholic Church, or even some of the most anarchistic and decentralized practices like Quaker Christianity, reclaiming witchcraft, and other similar forms of spirituality. This makes a certain amount of sense. When you are dealing with the spiritual, it makes sense that authority is going to be closely related to and defined by spiritual terms, precepts, and assumptions. That doesn't necessarily mean this is good, however. And this gets us to the question of how authority is constructed. Now, as I said with the example of divine right of kings, democracy, and other similar instances in between, authority can be organized in many different ways. And I'm going to use, again, the examples of the Catholic Church and the Quakers as two sort of opposite poles that effectively represent the range that you can see. And this is just within Christianity, by the way. When you're talking pagan practices, it gets even more diverse, potentially complex and confusing, depending on where you look and how you look at it. Within the Catholic Church, and according to Catholic dogma, the Pope is the supreme authority who is elected by the wisest and most learned among the Church's elders, which is to say the College of Cardinals in the modern day, to serve as the descendant of St. Peter. It is this apostolic succession, which is to say, drawing a sort of initiatory lineage back to the Apostle Peter, that gives the Catholic Church's hierarchy, and specifically the Pope, beginning initially as the Bishop of Rome, the authority to claim the power that they do within Christendom broadly and within the Church specifically. The Quakers sort of take the opposite end by saying that everybody is capable of feeling the Holy Spirit move within them and give voice, and that the way they resolve these is through collective meetings where members of the particular local Quaker group will come together to meet and reach some kind of consensus about how to best move forward. You could say, essentially, that these two different models represent sort of poles of, on one hand, you can have this very specific delegation of divine authority to particular individuals, or you can see it as being dispersed among all of those who are practitioners, with considerable range in between, by the way. When I'm presenting these as poles, I don't want you to think of these as binary opposites, but more as points on a broad spectrum. You can see similar stuff at work broadly in paganism. Gardnerian witchcraft, for example, has something of a hierarchy, though it's not a very steep one, where you could say that the grades that exist are essentially those who are aspiring to learning, those who have completed degrees of initiation, and then those who have completed third degree, which is the highest level of initiation, and are recognized as the high priest or high priestess of their particular coven. Which is to say not so much that they are necessarily the final word on matters spiritual. That depends very much on how the particular coven operates, but more are the sort of chief wrangler of cats, for lack of a better way of putting it. Most forms of druidry, particularly with the order of bards, ovates, and druids, follows a more, you could say, vertical in form kind of structure, where those who are first beginning as druids are initiated at the bardic level, where they learn the stories and the art of telling story and understanding myth, before they are then initiated to the level of the ovates as healers and mystics. And then finally, after considerable work and experience, are initiated to the level of druid, essentially the priests, philosophers, and most learned within their particular community. The case of heathenry is more complicated, mostly because heathenry in its various forms never really has had a strong kind of deliberate initiatory element to it. There are certainly formal as well as more informal forms of initiation that exist, but generally speaking, what tends to confer authority within heathenry, formally or otherwise, is deep study of the lore. And the lore includes everything from the Eddas and sagas to knowledge of history, archaeology, and all kinds of other things that are relevant and related to this. This is not always the case, as sometimes there are groups that lean more into mystical trappings and elements as a way of establishing that authority, as well as laying claim to having a direct conduit to the powers. But generally speaking, this sort of informally constructed authority within many heathen spaces tends to operate in a way that most would try to argue is similar to academia, but having been inside the beast a bit, long enough to get more degrees than any person should really aspire to, I think it's more accurate to say that this informal construction of authority is closer to what you see in fan culture. What I mean by that, and I do not intend this in any denigrating way, but rather as a basis of comparison, is that within many forms of pop cultural fandom within the modern world, authority tends to be attached to those who know more and display more knowledge of the object of that fandom. Now, as anyone can tell you who's ever been around different kinds of fandom, this leads to a lot of problems around bullying and tendencies towards cult of personality, and also allows some of the more toxic elements to really run amok. One might call this anarchic, though I think that would be a deliberate misunderstanding of what that word as well as what anarchy actually is. And I think it's more accurate to say that when we're talking this kind of construction of authority within heathenry, that what you're facing is an excellent example of what is described in anarchist circles as the tyranny of structurelessness. What that means is that when you are in a society or a space where there are no defined structures for mediating problems, resolving disputes, and settling these questions of what is and is not authority or an acceptable way of acting towards other people, that you essentially wind up by default with some variation on might makes right. And what that might looks like in the case of some heathen spaces is essentially those who have the means, one could say the privilege and the luxury, to study this material at great depth and then effectively mobilize that material to support their particular positions. This is not to say this is always the case. And I am also not arguing that therefore we should abandon study of the lore and exploration of myth. Far from it. I think that these are things that are absolutely essential to what it is we're doing. Otherwise, why would I even be a heathen in the first place? More what I'm saying is that when there really isn't a clear concept of how authority is being constructed, the default tends towards this tyranny of structurelessness. What I think particularly enables this within heathenry as well is heathenry's, especially in America and Canada's, strong dependence on the use of academic and historical sources as a basis for practice. The reason why this is a problem, or at least can be a problem, is because of this other fun thing we get from political science called legitimacy. Now, legitimacy is, to sort of turn back to dictionary definitions again, essentially the belief that a certain form or exercise of authority is justified. And this sense of certain sources being seen as legitimate or illegitimate is something that is used as a way of constructing this sort of formless authority that exists in many heathen spaces. The problem with it, though, is that this form of construction tends not to really take into account how knowledge really works within academia, treating what comes out of it as legitimate and authoritative without really delving deeper into how academics themselves, particularly of the periods where this source material comes from, tend to treat what they're working with a far greater degree of skepticism, as well as a far more reduced level of certainty than what you see in many heathen spaces. This is because people tend not to truly understand what it is that defines legitimacy. Within the world of political science, legitimacy is often defined as something that is held by the people who the authority is being exercised on or for. In short, it is an internal quality. It is something that is defined by the people who are under or operating within the bounds of a given authority. An action is seen as legitimate because it is operating within channels and means that are seen as legitimate by those people. This is something that I think really does need to be better understood within heathen spaces specifically, as well as within paganism generally. Just because something comes from an institution that is authoritative in broader society doesn't necessarily mean that we as a community have to treat it, or particular interpretations of it, as inherently legitimate. Legitimacy is not something that is imposed. It is something that is realized and expressed. This is something I think that is especially significant within heathenry because, at least from where I sit and based on my interpretation of the source material, there are many grounds and many examples within the history of the Nordic peoples, as well as what we see within surviving myth, where it is not only justified, but morally necessary to undo and destroy illegitimate authority and replace it with authority that holds legitimacy. As for examples, you can turn to cases like the downfall of Ymir, the myth of On, as well as instances from the Heimskringla, such as the confrontation by Thorgny Lagman at the Thing of All Swedes in approximately the year 1000. You could also say the founding of the Icelandic Commonwealth by inhabitants of the newly established Kingdom of Norway, who felt King Harald Fairhair's government was inherently illegitimate, was a form of revolt, though not so much in the form of rising up and destroying the power, but rather by voting with their feet, or in this case their oars and sails, to seek out somewhere different to construct a new kind of social order that they saw as more legitimate. This entangling of authority and legitimacy is something that becomes particularly problematic when heathens uncritically mimic mainstream spiritual institutions as well as other similar institutions within society, like academia. In turning to this pattern of mimicry, I want to start first from a place of understanding and, to an extent, some compassion for those heathens who have, consciously or otherwise, turned to models of mainstream institutions to develop their own. And this makes a certain amount of sense. To the casual observer, the different institutions of the society around us, like, say, the great religions of the world, or different governments, academic institutions, charities, other similar organizations, all have an appearance of power, solidity, continuity, and from that, a sort of deeply ingrained authority that comes with all of that. This all also implies to an extent that these groups are somewhat, well, to put it in air quotes, successful. After all, they're exercising power on a massive scale in some cases. So it does make a certain sense on the surface to look at these different institutions and to borrow from those institutions. This is also something that is somewhat enforced within the societies we live in. The United States, to give one example, and this is something that I'm becoming increasingly familiar with as the Fellowship of Fire and Ice jumps through the hoops that is getting our legal paperwork in order, deeply ingrains a lot of Christian assumptions into how the law talks about religious organizations. For example, the 501c3 classification that's given to tax-exempt religious organizations has two particular categories that you can choose from. One is a general religious organization, which can, but isn't always, what we would call a spiritual institution. It could simply be an organization of, like, say, Catholics who share a particular dedication to an interpretation of social justice theory within their church. And churches. And that's the term that is specifically used by the IRS and by the federal government for referring to specific religious organizations that have clergy and have the specific rights and protections that exist within U.S. law for churches and other religious organizations. Specific legal protections, such as the legal protection of clerical counsel within a court of law, as well as the colloquially described right to marry and bury, are ones that also borrow from the norms that you see for Christian clergy. These are the things that are the core functions of Christian forms of clergy, so these become how it's referred to within the law. You also see very commonly the title that is used for lack of any other form for referring to clergy is reverend, even though that is something that is specifically a Christian form of address. It's very easy, in other words, to simply go along with these defaults unless one consciously and deliberately frames what you are doing in different terms and under different models. When these are the norms that exist within the world, it's easy to see why people just sort of go with the flow, especially because, at least at first blush, these Christian forms are seemingly quite successful and effective. This does, of course, leave aside that these Christian forms have become the dominant, successful, and effective ones because of their ability to construct alliances with political power and those who are willing to use coercive measures to impose different forms of Christianity on the world, as well as the deeper historical legacies of things like the doctrine of discovery. But if one's understanding of spiritual and religious organization is one that doesn't reach into that deeper past, it's really easy to just sort of go down the established path. After all, it looks like it's worked, right? As long as you pay no attention to all the bodies, anyway. One particular aspect of how this form of spiritual authority is constructed that tends to snare up heathens in particular is the concept of the sacred text. Now, sacred texts, in the sense of this document or this particular poem or song or what have you that is carried on through an oral tradition or something similar, being assigned particular spiritual significance, is not something that is a new invention that comes with Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, or any of the other great religions of the world. We've got examples of what you could describe as sacred texts going all the way back to Pharaonic Egypt, literally graven into the walls of tombs and pyramids. What is, however, the new invention that came to us beginning with Christianity was the idea of a singular sacred spiritual text, which is to say, one specific document that is held up as the authoritative word of God above all other things, and that is described as the source from which all belief and practice flows from. This then got especially hammered into the collective consciousness of Christianity and all the societies it influenced, care of the Protestant Reformation. By the time the heathen revival was kicking off, the idea of a singular sacred text that is the source of all knowledge and answers for that particular spirituality was pretty well hammered into the collective consciousness of all the regions where heathenry first emerged. And unfortunately, quite a few of those early heathens, instead of interrogating where this came from, or addressing how the deeper myths were ultimately a fragment of a much broader, rich oral tradition that has suffered a combination of destruction, suppression, and co-optation over the centuries, instead pointed to the Poetic and Prose Eddas as sort of an ersatz heathen Bible. While this has been gradually deconstructed and is not as much the case now as it was even, say, 10 years ago, it did also lead to something of an unintended consequence for how the lore more broadly tends to be treated. Now, I'm not saying this was something that was consciously or deliberately done, or at least I don't have evidence to suggest that, so I don't want to be construed or seen as suggesting that, because that's not what I'm suggesting. I think it's more that people looked at these broader patterns that existed within the world and said, well, hey, we have our own Bible too, and then just sort of broadened the definition of the word Bible a bit as a way of establishing the legitimacy and authority of our spiritual practice. This was, I think, both an understandable act of self-definition as well as a somewhat defensive response to the newness and the perceived lack of legitimacy that was carried by heathenry as being part of this broader new religious movement that we call paganism. I also want to stress, by the way, that this is not something that's a uniquely heathen problem. Claims of ancient knowledge, long-lost sources of material, and other similar kinds of appeals to deeper authority within the distant past abound throughout paganisms. And it's only within, I'd say, the last 10 to 20 years or so that this has really begun to be seriously interrogated, deconstructed, and for paganisms as a movement to shift from claiming to be a continuity from what existed before to not just recognizing, but also embracing the fact that we are a new religious movement that is inspired by what came before, and we are just as legitimate as any of those folks who have been around for 2,000 years or more. Regardless of the origins of this response and this broader phenomena, the reality is that the lore in general, and the Eddas in particular, became a means of constructing authority because it sort of made sense to do that if one didn't look too closely at how these bigger religious systems had genuinely constructed their authority, their influence, and their place within society. I also think this was not something that's totally necessary. I think that embracing the deeper truth of where the lore comes from, of engaging with how it was in its day a living body of oral tradition that was an expression of a particular group of people's understanding and ways of interacting with the world, as well as constructing meaning, that we can get at a much richer understanding of this material, as well as a much more robust and genuinely legitimate way of endowing ourselves with shared authority in ways that lift everybody up, rather than creating systems where some must be raised and others must be driven down. If there's any mythic precedent for that, it's how we can turn to examples of that even the gods came together in great assemblies to make decisions like shaping physical reality, deciding how they would handle the question of offerings, and even in the face of Ragnarok and their own ultimate doom, deciding what would be done. So let's now turn to the specific manifestations of mimicry that lead to abusive, high-control forms of authority, which is to say, fascism, as best exemplified by the Folkish movement, as well as more general cults of personality. What I'm going to do here is get more into how these manifestations and forms of authority in many ways mimic what exists within broader society. If you want more details on how they tend to form and operate, I've got 2 other episodes, namely episodes 34 and 35, that get into this in a lot more detail. So let's first talk cult of personality generally. Cult of personality is something that has a lot of precedent in many different ways within mainstream social institutions. Whether our society wants to admit it or not, the cult of personality is a thing that's a very common way of constructing and maintaining authority within the world that we live in today. When it comes specifically to religion, you could say that mainstream Christianity in a lot of ways already has built-in tendencies towards cult of personality, care of the pastoral model of clergy. What I mean by this is the tendency within many Christian denominations to vest power within one or a handful of clergy members who are then supposed to see to the spiritual well-being of their congregations, serve as guides for setting moral examples, and interpret the will of God and the Word of God for their congregations. Even churches that use systems like councils of elected deacons and other models for reining in the power of pastors still really kind of lean into the importance of these particular figures. So it's not hard to see why many pagan groups, when this model is already one that's already out there, tend to lean into it. It is easy, after all, to simply give all the power and all the authority or at least enough of it that it may as well be the dominant force, to that particular individual who's especially charismatic, gifted at organization, and all those other things that are required to be able to do these kinds of jobs. It does also make it easy to build these kind of communities, because all you really have to do to build them out is latch onto a sort of parasocial relationship, as well as more direct social relationships between the particular individual who is the most revered within the congregation and anyone who's coming into that community. This tendency also gets encouraged by things like our political systems. It's not hard to argue that as democracy tends to function now, it often devolves towards cult of personality and has similar kinds of tendencies. American politics, for example, has arguably been one long string since at least the days of Richard Nixon of the two parties seeking to change out the person at the top and create cult of personality around that individual as a way of building legitimacy for their governments and developing momentum for their political programs. This is something that's also a shift away from how politics had previously been done, of where it wasn't just about the one person that's getting elected, but more broadly about what that party and the organs of that party stood for. This also absolutely is on display in the world of business, where increasingly this figure of the super genius CEO is held up as the personification of everything that their company represents, and through this as a way of establishing legitimacy and power for that company. The industry where this easily is the most on display, though certainly not the only one, is the tech industry, where increasingly Silicon Valley leads into these sort of super genius, ersatz Tony Stark kind of figures like Sam Altman, or at one point Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg, and Bill Gates as these examples of these incredible, super talented, brilliant men who actually, when you dig a little deeper and you look through the skeletons in the closet, you find out they're actually really not much different from other business leaders. And as we can see in cases like Sam Altman or Mark Zuckerberg fairly recently, maybe aren't even the geniuses that they have been made out to be. One particular manifestation of this tendency that absolutely happens within different paganisms and within heathenry especially is what's referred to as founder's syndrome, which is to say that an organization or a particular movement becomes so defined by a particular founder, their ideas and their approaches, as well as their direct influence, that the loss of that founder can cause serious problems for that organization. It also makes it difficult to challenge that founder, especially when it's necessary for the health of that organization or community to grow, move forward, or address deep systemic issues. All of these particular elements are then especially on display when we're talking about authority within the folkish movement and fascist elements of heathenry and paganism generally. Now, what sets these groups apart in terms of how they're able to build authority and project the appearance of authority to the broader world and appeal to people is that fascism and fascistic ideologies have a particular 1-2 punch that makes them different from other cults of personality. This combination is a blend of the appearance of a functional, harmonious community that is guided by the great wise leader, and the appearance of action against perceived problems. Now, the appearance of harmonious unity under the rule of the great wise leader, whatever you call them or however you justify them, is something that is essential to the myth of fascism, going back to the classical fascisms, which are Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and other similar movements. Where cult of personality to varying degrees, either actively or passively, leans into this idea of that we should just delegate everything to these incredible, capable individuals, fascism explicitly says that it is necessary to unite behind the vision of a great leader who is the manifestation of the desires and will of their people. And that people is also one that actively excludes anyone who is labeled as degenerate in some form or another. It is this vision of everything being unified, pure, lacking dissension, and operating in lockstep that can make for a very appealing image, especially for people who feel that they have been left out or left behind by society as it currently exists. This appeal is something that I think is especially important for heathens to reckon with, as well as broader society, because we currently live in a society that has gone out of its way to obliterate all forms of social bonds that are not mediated by commerce and markets. Neoliberalism, in its drive to make everything into an economic relationship, has very effectively destroyed all other forms of social belonging and bringing people together. I think it is safe to say that the disillusionment, the sense of isolation, and the breakdown of social relations that has resulted from plowing under third space and non-commercial forms of interaction is at the center of what has made fascism in all its forms, whether you're talking the MAGA movement, elements of the British extreme right, and other similar movements surging throughout Europe and other parts of the world, so appealing. When there is no sense of belonging, or rather the only sense of belonging that society allows you is wake up, go to work, come home, recover, maybe do some housework, possibly have a little bit of time for socializing or pursuing some hobbies that you enjoy, then go to sleep and do it all over again without really any sense of meaning, direction, or agency, it's not hard to see why people might find appeal in saying, you know what, I'm just going to put it all on that strongman who's promising to fix everything and also give my life a sense of meaning and purpose. This brings us to the appearance of action and how this also creates its own form of authority and an appearance of things moving forward. Now, when I'm talking appeal to action, what I'm talking is fascism's preference for violent action and other forms of action over deliberation, intellectual exploration, creativity, and other forms of human expression. This gives the appearance of getting things done, making things happen, solving problems, and all those other kinds of things, even though I think that if you run everything based on let's just run around and hit things until they stop being a problem, eventually you run out of things to hit, and you also tend to destroy everything that is within your path. That said, while you're on that process, it can be very intoxicating. And it also gives the appearance of, again, creating a sense of purpose, of giving people something that is fulfilling, and creating the illusion of things being solved. in a way that makes a certain kind of sense, even if the solution itself is either not sustainable or is in truth incredibly horrific and destructive in its process, while also deliberately suppressing, denying, and mutilating critical elements of the human experience and human expression. When we step away from the folkish movement, it's not hard to find examples that the folkish movement borrowed from, mimics, and builds on. Whether you're looking at megachurches, charismatic denominations like the New Apostolic Reformation, the MAGA movement, or the white nationalist movement and its various different sects, there's plenty of examples of outright fascist elements within society, as well as people who are willing to provide funding, support, and resources for them. This is also part of what makes fascism a distinct thing from garden variety cult of personality. It isn't just a model that can be duplicated, it is a movement that actively works to support anyone who is a fellow traveler, because any kind of fascism moving forward is something that makes it easier for all fascisms to advance in some way or another. It is also a path that heathens particularly have had experience with, and we know where it goes, and why it is worth staying away from that direction. So, to wrap things up, I think what is at the core of grappling with heathenry's shadow is accepting that as a movement, we have something of an inferiority complex that leads to a really messy relationship with authority. This messy relationship tends towards heathens unconsciously or sometimes consciously mimicking forms of authority that exist within broader society without really questioning if these forms of authority truly reflect the myth and spirituality that we're working with, or are healthy and sustainable for the communities that we're trying to build. Part of what influences this is that we often conflate legitimacy with authority, and I think to resolve this, need to really ask ourselves what makes something truly legitimate for us, so that we can then construct authority that genuinely reflects our needs, our expectations, and our approaches more effectively. We do have many rich examples from within our own myth, history, and lore that we can draw on for constructing different kinds of authority that are genuinely reflective of people's needs, that serve the needs of people and community, and embrace the strengths of our current movement, such as the room that it makes for individual expression and spiritual exploration, the intellectual inquisitiveness that is common throughout heathen practice, and the beginnings of a culture of deliberation and discussion, as opposed to online debate. We have the beginnings of what we would need to forge our own path and our own way forward. It is now up to us to ask these hard questions and to begin to take these steps through our shadow and into a better, more integrated future for the whole of the heathen movement. And on that, thank you for listening. This has been Ryan Smith at The Wayward Wanderer, signing off. If you want to find out more about radical heathen practice, head on over to onblackwings.com, where you can find articles, classes, resources, and more. This podcast was created and produced by Ryan Smith. Thanks for listening.